Good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm Evelyn, and it is so great to have you here with me. Please take a second to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. Also, let me know in the comments section what city you're tuning in from, because I love seeing just how far my stories can travel. I never thought of myself as a woman who could be easily fooled. For 35 years, I worked as a pediatric nurse at our community hospital in Richmond, Virginia. Over more than 3 decades, I watched children get their vaccines, beat terrible illnesses, and learned a thing or two about reading people. I could tell with a single glance which kid was hiding the fact that they ate candy they weren't supposed to have, and I could spot the subtle signs of domestic violence a young mother was trying to hide behind a forced smile. I thought I knew human nature inside and out, but I completely misjudged the people closest to me. My husband, Arthur, was a quiet man. He wasn't cold or distant. He was just like one of those deep rivers that keeps a calm, restrained surface over a powerful current. We met when we were young, and we built our life together slowly and solidly, brick by brick. We bought a historic brick townhouse in the Fan District, which featured a beautiful interior courtyard I absolutely adored, and a glass greenhouse where Arthur was always trying to help me garden, even though he usually just ended up killing the plants. He spent his entire life working as a structural engineer. He wasn't flashy, he never played any of those Wall Street capital games, he just did his meticulous, careful work at a local architectural firm. He rarely talked about money around the house. He always said that as long as the foundation is poured correctly, the house will take care of itself. I just smiled and let him handle all the finances. That was our unspoken agreement, and it worked perfectly for 28 years of marriage. When Arthur passed away in the fall of 2018 from complications of early-onset Alzheimer's, I became a person I didn't even recognize. Immense grief hollows you out, leaving a shell that looks like you but can't function like you. To make matters worse, I had just undergone major surgery on both eyes for severe cataracts during those exact months. In a fog of near blindness, I could barely even manage the stairs. I forgot to eat, and I forgot to pay the bills. One time, I stood in the frozen food aisle at Safeway for 20 whole minutes, holding a box of frozen macaroni and cheese, completely unable to remember why I had even walked into the store. That was when Mitchell and Valerie stepped into my life. Mitchell was Arthur's nephew, and he ran a tech startup up in Alexandria. He had a booming voice and a smooth, polished way of handling people, always ready with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. His wife, Valerie, was his perfect match. She was a high-end interior designer who practically radiated luxury and warmth, though it was that highly theatrical kind of warmth you usually get from luxury real estate agents or country club greeters. The week after the funeral, they drove down from Northern Virginia in their brand-new Tesla, bringing expensive French pastries, cheap condolences, and a seemingly thoughtful suggestion. Valerie sat across from me at my old oak dining table, holding my hand, and told me that with my health and my eyesight the way they were, I was in no condition to deal with complicated estate taxes and property bills. She suggested that Mitchell temporarily handle the day-to-day income and expenses for my commercial rental properties, just as a stopgap measure until I was fully back on my feet. I agreed. Of course I agreed. Every waking hour, my brain felt just as lost as it did when I was holding that heavy box of frozen macaroni. Mitchell brought over a thick stack of documents, explaining that it was just a temporary administrative authorization so he could legally collect the rent checks and pay the property taxes for me. He pushed the paperwork toward me with the effortless confidence of a man who was used to giving orders. I signed everywhere he told me to sign. I didn't read it carefully. I was 62, I had gauze over my eyes, and I was drowning in the grief of losing my husband. So I didn't read it carefully. That is the one thing I will never truly forgive myself for. A few years passed. I retired, focused on taking care of my greenhouse, and learned how to live with the silence of being alone. Mitchell and Valerie would call on birthdays and Thanksgiving, and whenever they visited, they would bring a few bottles of expensive red wine, always asking how I was doing in that performative, overly concerned tone. I took it all at face value. After all, why would I doubt them? The first crack in the facade appeared about 18 months ago. I finally decided to update my will, something my old friend Helen had been nagging me to do for years. I made an appointment with an estate attorney named Sarah Hopkins, and she asked me to provide an inventory of my assets. I dug out the fireproof lockbox Arthur had left behind, the one labeled Family Asset Blueprints. Inside, there were copies of the deeds to a few commercial storefronts in historic Richmond, some insurance policies and bank statements. The numbers didn't add up. I was just a retired nurse, not an auditor, but I knew what Arthur had told me our monthly rental income was supposed to be. I knew what my retirement was supposed to look like, but the rental profits I saw in that folder were only about 30% of what I expected. I told myself I was just misremembering things, that maybe the commercial real estate market was down after the pandemic, or that there had to be a simple explanation. But a tiny, cold knot settled deep in my chest, and it never went away. From that point on, I started looking at everything differently. Little details caught my eye, like the sudden massive influx of cash into Mitchell's company, and the lavish vacation photos Valerie kept posting on social media, showing off ski chalets in Aspen, private yachts in St. Bart's, and vineyards in Tuscany. They had always been well off, but this was a completely different level of spending. When I casually mentioned to Mitchell that I was thinking about hiring an independent financial advisor to take a look at the books, the warmth in his voice dropped by exactly 1 degree. Just 1 degree. But I am a woman who spent 35 years watching the micro-expressions of patients' families. I noticed it. Then came the morning that changed everything. I walked into the county tax assessor's office next to City Hall to pick up a minor boundary permit. I needed to pay about $8,000 in surveying and construction fees to expand my greenhouse, which was desperate for renovations. A young clerk behind the counter named David typed my name and social security number into his computer. He looked at the screen, looked up at me, and then looked back at the screen again. He picked his words very carefully, asking why I was requesting a payment plan for an $8,000 permit when an offshore holding company under my name had just liquidated a commercial land deal in Fairfax County for $52 million. I just sat there completely frozen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and someone was talking on the phone across the room. I asked him if he could repeat that. David said it again. $52,120,000. It was registered under an LLC formed back in 2012, and the actual controlling entity was the Arthur Hayes Irrevocable Trust, with the sole, absolute beneficiary listed as Evelyn Hayes. I asked David for a cup of water, and he brought it over in a paper cup. I sipped it slowly, trying to force my brain to process the information. Arthur had never mentioned this holding company or this land to me. Not once in the 6 years between 2012 and his death. It wasn't in his lockbox, and it wasn't in any of the paperwork Mitchell had shown me. I had handed Mitchell administrative access to every account and property I knew about, but somehow, this massive fortune had never come to light. Was it a coincidence? Does a person completely forget about a $52 million trust asset just out of pure carelessness? I drove home on autopilot. I sat down at my oak dining table, the exact spot where Valerie had sat years ago when she offered to help me. I placed my hands flat on the wooden surface and took a deep breath. Through the back window, I could see my greenhouse, where the May herbs were growing beautifully. Everything looked normal. It all looked mockingly, perfectly normal. Then I opened my laptop and started digging into everything. I wasn't an accountant, but I was a woman who had precisely calculated countless doses of medication for sick children over 3 decades. I knew that if a medication isn't working right, you have to recheck the formula. I pulled up every single rental statement from Arthur's safe and cross-referenced the dates. Using my neatest chart-printing handwriting, I wrote out rows of numbers on a yellow legal pad. By midnight, I had pieced together a rough outline of what was happening, and it was incredibly ugly. Over the 6 years Mitchell had been managing my 3 commercial properties, roughly $650,000 in home equity loans and rental income had vanished in ways I couldn't explain. The money had been funneled into entity accounts I had never heard of, disguised under fabricated charges for property upgrades and management consulting fees that never actually happened. $650,000. Money that belonged to me had been quietly skimmed away over 6 years, in increments small enough to avoid triggering any anti-money laundering red flags at the bank. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. Here was the thing that terrified me the most. Mitchell had absolutely no idea that $52 million holding company even existed. If he had known, he would have found a way to drain it a long time ago. Arthur had clearly hidden it on purpose, locking it down tight and transferring the beneficiary rights directly to me to bypass the lengthy probate process. This meant Mitchell had stolen everything he could get his hands on, but he had completely missed the actual vault. If I rushed over to Mitchell's mansion in Alexandria tomorrow to confront him, I would essentially be handing him a live grenade. I thought about calling the police. I thought about calling my attorney, Sarah. I thought about calling my sister in Seattle. What I actually did was close my laptop, go to bed, and stare at the dark ceiling for 4 hours. Fear is a strange thing. It doesn't always make you feel small. Sometimes it makes you incredibly focused and sharp. Around 3 a.m, lying there in Arthur's house, in Arthur's bed, thinking about Mitchell spending Arthur's money on trips to Tuscany and Aspen ski chalets, I felt something shift inside me. The hollow, grieving shell of a woman who had signed those papers in a blind fog 6 years ago was still in there somewhere, but she was no longer at the wheel. I realized this was Arthur's final gift to me. He had built this fortress quietly and carefully, just like he did everything else in life. He never made a fuss. He just made sure I would be safe. He left it for me, and I intended to protect it. The plan took shape over the following week. There was nothing dramatic about it. There were no elaborate schemes, no fancy tricks, and no cinematic showdowns. It was just a plan made by a careful, patient woman who spent her entire career watching fragile lives, a woman who deeply understood that the best way to protect something vulnerable is to keep absolutely, perfectly quiet. Step 1. Total radio silence. Not a single word to Mitchell. No hints, no confrontations, no loaded questions about money. Our relationship had to look exactly the same as it always did. Step 2. Get real, heavy-hitting legal representation. No offense to Sarah Hopkins. She's great for a standard will, but she was out of her depth here. I needed a litigator who specialized in commercial fraud and white-collar crime. I needed someone who could move quietly but with absolute ruthless aggression. Step 3. Document every single thing. Every transfer, every bogus fee, every anomaly I found. I needed an ironclad paper trail before we made a single move. And step 4, lock down that $52 million holding company and trust account. Move it, secure it, and make sure that if Mitchell ever stumbled onto its existence, he couldn't touch a single dime. I wrote those 4 steps down on my yellow legal pad. Then I tore the page out, folded it twice, and tucked it inside an old copy of Gray's Anatomy on my bookshelf, a place Mitchell wouldn't look in a million years. I brewed some coffee. I watered the plants in the greenhouse. I smiled at myself in the mirror. I had a plan. The attorney I found was named Marcus Thorne. Helen, my oldest friend, and the only person I'd trusted with the truth, helped me track him down. Sitting in her kitchen, I made her swear to secrecy, and the sheer gravity of it caught her off guard. She looked at me after I explained everything and asked if I was sure about this. I told her I had never been sure of anything in my life. Thorne's office was on the 12th floor of a downtown corporate building, complete with thick carpets and federal court certificates arranged on the wall in a way that felt both deliberate and understated. He was a former federal prosecutor turned private wealth litigator somewhere in his late collection of 50s, and he possessed an unhurried, commanding presence. He had a habit of taking off his reading glasses and setting them on the desk before he spoke. I liked him instantly. I laid everything out on his desk. The holding company documents, the folders, my yellow legal pad, and the inexplicable transaction records. He didn't interrupt me once. He just listened in total silence. Then he put his glasses back on and started looking over the numbers. He leaned back and said, "Mrs. Hayes, this isn't just a civil dispute. We are looking at potential criminal conduct here. But before we determine our exact strategy, I need the officially certified records for all these accounts going back to 2018, not your copies. I need the original certified prints straight from the financial institutions." I asked him how I was supposed to get those without tipping Mitchell off. "Because you are the account owner and the sole beneficiary of the trust," Thorne explained. "You have the absolute legal right to request your own records. The bank has no obligation to notify Mitchell, and frankly, he has no right to know." He paused for a moment before adding, "Based on what you've shown me, he likely never had the legal authority to take out equity loans against your properties anyway. You never granted him an indefinite power of attorney while you were in a clear, documented state of sound mind and body." That hit me hard. I had signed those papers at my dining room table while half blind and barely functioning. Whatever was on those pages, it certainly wasn't what Mitchell had verbally described to me. I left Thorne's office with a checklist of official record requests, walking back to my car with a quiet, burning fury that I took great care to hide behind a calm face. The requests went out that week. The first real bump in the road came 11 days later. Out of nowhere, something shifted on Mitchell's end. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe he caught wind of my visit to the estate lawyer and had been keeping tabs on me, or maybe it was just pure criminal instinct. That sixth sense people like him develop when they know they're guilty. It was a Friday, just a week after I submitted the paperwork for the records, when Mitchell called. "Hey, Aunt Evelyn, just checking in on you," he said. "How are you doing, dear?" He hadn't called me dear in probably a decade. I sat quietly in the wicker chair in my courtyard, keeping my voice as warm and pleasant as always. "Oh, I'm doing wonderfully, Mitchell. The weather out here is just beautiful. The time is really coming in." That's great, he replied, his voice smooth. "Hey, I've been meaning to swing by and go over some routine paperwork for the rental properties with you. Just some standard maintenance signatures, you know the drill. Maybe next week?" "Of course," I said. "You're welcome anytime." I hung up the phone and just sat there with my herbs in the fading evening light. It was crystal clear to me. Mitchell was starting to smell smoke. The certified records arrived on a Tuesday, and I drove them straight to Thorne's office. He spent 40 minutes reviewing the pages while I sat in the client chair, watching the certificates on his wall. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was entirely professional, cold, and calculated. "Mrs. Hayes, I can tell you with absolute certainty that between 2018 and 2024, roughly $658,000 was stripped from the equity of your commercial properties," Thorne said. "It was funneled through a series of fake renovation invoices, consulting fees, and direct wire transfers into a Delaware LLC called Apex Tech Solutions. That happens to be Mitchell's startup. From what we can see, this company never provided a single actual service to your properties. More importantly, the structure of these transfers is incredibly specific. Every single wire transfer was kept under $9,900, which tells me he was deliberately structuring the transactions to evade the Federal Bank Secrecy Act's $10,000 mandatory reporting threshold." I listened to him, absorbing every single word. "Is that a crime?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "Structuring transactions to avoid federal reporting is a federal felony," Thorne said. "And that's not even counting the civil fraud of misrepresenting documents to induce you into signing a power of attorney while you were visually impaired and in a documented state of extreme grief." The fluorescent lights in his office were different from the ones in the county building, but in both places, I sat perfectly still, breathing slowly, waiting for the world to reshuffle itself around the truth. "What do we do now?" I asked. Thorne leaned forward slightly. "Now we start building the lawsuit, and you continue to give Mitchell absolutely no indication that anything has changed." I thought back to our phone call. The time is really coming in. I figured I was doing a pretty good job so far. "One more thing," Thorne added. "That $52 million holding company and the trust. We need to move it immediately. Not just to another institution, but into an absolute protective structure under your name alone, with zero secondary access. If Mitchell somehow finds out it exists, we need to make sure it's behind a firewall he can never touch." We started the transfer paperwork that very afternoon. Thorne told me later that the point of no return was the exact moment I received those certified records. He was right. Up until that Tuesday, I could have lied to myself and said I was just remembering things wrong. I could have accepted whatever excuse Mitchell threw at me. I could have gone on being the woman who blindly signed papers at her dining room table, but that version of me was completely gone now. On a Thursday morning in late July, Thorne officially filed the civil fraud lawsuit. Along with the filing, he sent a formal notice via certified mail directly to Mitchell, requiring a signature upon delivery. Thorne explained that this was standard procedure for civil fraud cases. Mitchell would have it by Friday. Thursday night, I stayed out in my courtyard. I pulled weeds until my knees ached, then sat on the steps with a glass of iced tea, listening to the neighborhood settle into the evening. A neighbor's dog barked a couple of times. I could hear the rhythmic sound of automatic sprinklers down the street. I had set something irreversible in motion, and I just sat there with that reality, the same way you sit with the weather. I didn't fight it. I just coexisted with it, Friday morning at 7:48 a.m., Mitchell called. I let it go straight to voicemail. Then I stood in the kitchen in my robe and played the message. His voice was incredibly controlled. That was the first sign. Mitchell was the kind of man who became intensely quiet when he was terrified, and right now, he was clearly terrified. Aunt Evelyn, I received a letter this morning and I think there's been a massive misunderstanding here. His voice echoed through the speaker. I need you to call me back. There are a lot of things you don't understand about how Arthur managed these properties back in the day. I don't want you getting bad advice from people who don't have your best interests at heart. Call me. I forwarded the voicemail to Thorne and didn't call him back. On Saturday, they showed up at my house. I was out in the greenhouse repotting some orchids when I heard the car pull up, that brand new Tesla. He and Valerie didn't even bother knocking on the front door. They walked straight around the side gate, which told me everything I needed to know about how they were choosing to handle this. Valerie was holding a handmade baking dish filled with delicate French macarons. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh out loud. Aunt Evelyn, Mitchell said, his voice trying to strike a perfect chord between warmth and deep offense. We need to talk. You should have called first, I said, without taking off my gardening gloves or standing up. We were worried about you, Valerie said, placing the dish on the wooden greenhouse table like a peace offering or a stage prop. We feel like someone has been giving you some incredibly wrong information and we just... Mr. Thorne handles all communications now, I cut her off. You have his number. Mitchell's composure shattered in an instant. It was just a brief twitch at the corner of his eye, but it was there. Evelyn, listen to me, he said. If you keep pushing this, you are going to destroy this family. Arthur would be absolutely devastated if he were here to see this. He trusted me with... With what? I asked. Total silence. With what, Mitchell? What exactly did Arthur trust you with? Please, say it out loud, clear as day. He didn't. Of course he didn't. Valerie placed her hand on his arm, and I watched the two of them recalibrating their strategy in real time. We can settle this quietly between us, Mitchell finally said, dropping the wounded act entirely. His voice was flat now, and this version of him was somehow much easier to deal with because it was actually honest. You don't understand what it means for a civil case like this to enter the public record. Your name, Arthur's reputation, all our personal business out there for everyone to see. Is that really what you want? To drag his lifetime of hard work through the mud? My attorney will be in touch, I said. I stood up, picked up my trowel, and walked into the main house. I locked the back door behind me. I heard them stand out in the courtyard for another minute, and then I heard the car engine start. I sat on the kitchen floor for a little while after that. Not because I was breaking down, I wasn't, but because my legs just needed a break. I had just looked Mitchell straight in the eye and refused to give an inch. After 6 years of being managed, handled, and gently lied to, I sat in my greenhouse with my gardening gloves on and didn't back down a single fraction of an inch. But that threat about Arthur's reputation did hit home. I won't pretend it didn't. I called Thorne on Monday morning and we talked it over. Yes, civil court records are mostly public, but certain things can be filed under seal. We would handle it. He had dealt with this kind of thing plenty of times before. After that, I gave my nerves a 4-day vacation. Not by pausing Thorne's work, the lawsuit was still moving forward, but just by turning off that inner state of high alert. I drove down to Virginia Beach, not to visit anyone, but just to look at the ocean. I walked on the sand for 2 hours. That Friday, I had dinner with Helen. We didn't talk about the case at all. We talked about her granddaughter who had just started college, a book we had both read, and whether that new Italian place on Main Street was really as good as everyone said it was. It turned out it was. I came home feeling more like myself, grounded and ready for whatever was next. Their counteroffer came through a third party, which meant they had secured their own legal representation. A letter arrived from an attorney named Richard Crowley, who was representing Mitchell and Valerie, proposing a confidential settlement negotiation. The letter was incredibly professional, polite, and vaguely worded, but buried deep in the 4th paragraph was the number, $250,000. A one-time lump sum payment in exchange for dropping the civil suit and signing a mutual non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreement. I read that letter twice at my oak dining table, sitting in the exact same chair where Valerie had held that dish of pastries and kicked off 6 years of financial bleeding. $250,000 to erase the $650,000 they stole, and to try and protect the $52 million they had no business touching, using that money to wipe away 6 years of treating me like an easily manipulated grieving widow. Did they really believe that would work? Or was it just a test to see how much evidence I actually had, to see if I was still paralyzed by fear? I forwarded it to Thorne with a single note, "Please reject this." He called me that afternoon. "They also filed a counterclaim," he said, sounding entirely unfazed. "They're arguing that the agreement you signed in 2018 was a fully legal, binding contract that gave them legitimate authority over business decisions and asset restructuring. They claim all the fees collected and equity transferred were necessary measures to hedge financial risks." "Did they ever disclose those measures to me?" I asked. According to their filings, there's a vague exculpatory clause buried on page 11 of a 16-page contract filled with incredibly dense Wall Street financial jargon. A contract you signed right after your husband died, while visually impaired from cataract surgery. He paused. "We are going to tear that clause to shreds in court." I thanked him and hung up. I made a cup of tea and stood by the kitchen window, watching the autumn leaves swirl in the breeze across the courtyard. I wasn't afraid of Mitchell's counterclaim. Honestly, all I felt was a cold, pure clarity. They were going to fight dirty. Of course they were. They had too much to lose to just give up easily. But I had too much to defend, and I was never going to let this fight scare me back into being the woman who blindly followed orders at the dining table. That afternoon, I called my sister Eleanor out in Seattle. I told her everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Eleanor spoke. "Evelyn, I'm booking a flight to Richmond right now." She arrived 2 days later, hauling a massive suitcase and bringing a wave of protective anger that made me feel incredibly safe. Eleanor is 3 years younger than me, and she's always been the sharper, fiercer one of the two of us. As a retired middle school vice principal, she is organized, takes absolutely no nonsense, and knows exactly how to cross-examine a person. She sat at my table and read through every single piece of paper I had compiled. She didn't say a word for 20 whole minutes. "That little piece of work," she finally muttered. "He sat at our parents' Christmas table as a kid, eating our mother's turkey." "I know," I said. "He even flew back for Arthur's funeral and practically sobbed through the eulogy." "I know, Ellie." She looked at me squarely. "Are you doing okay?" "I am better than I have been in 6 years," I told her, and I meant every word. Eleanor stayed for a week. She came with me to a meeting with Thorne and asked 3 tactical questions that even had my lawyer calling her incredibly sharp. She reorganized my entire filing system, labeling everything clearly in alphabetical order. That was her way of helping. She cooked dinners that filled the house with a warmth it hadn't felt in a very long time. When it was time for her to leave, she stood at the front door, held both of my hands, and told me that Arthur knew exactly what he was doing. She said he left that account to me because he knew I was exactly the kind of strong woman he always believed I was. After her cab disappeared around the corner of the street, I kept those words close to my heart for a long time. Meanwhile, Mitchell and Valerie went completely quiet. No phone calls, no driving past the house. Crowley only communicated through Thorne. They were waiting, regrouping, and trying to figure out their next move. Let them look. I wasn't afraid of being watched anymore. My original estate lawyer, Sarah Hopkins, the one who first noticed the numbers didn't add up, introduced me to 2 other women who had gone through similar experiences. Their situations were different, but the core of the stories was identical. Being taken advantage of by someone they trusted during a period of extreme vulnerability. The 3 of us met for coffee at a vintage diner on the east side of town. We didn't talk about legal strategies. We talked about how it felt to realize you were being treated like a puppet, and the sheer power of deciding to cut the strings. Driving home, I thought about Arthur. I thought about how he spent his whole life working quietly, making careful calculations, never drawing attention to himself. I thought about how he bought that land years ago, tucked it away into a hidden holding company no one knew about, and simply let it sit there and appreciate over time until it turned into a multi-million-dollar liquidation. He knew. I don't think he was specifically trying to guard against Mitchell, but he understood the way the world worked. He knew how money could twist people, and he knew how grief could leave a person completely defenseless. So he built a wall around me that no one else knew about, not even me. I was going to finish what he started. They made another push in September, and this time they called ahead. That alone should have tipped me off that it was going to be a performance. Mitchell's voice on the phone was different. It was softer, stripped of that tech CEO gloss. Aunt Evelyn, I know we're in a terrible place right now, but you're my aunt, and I loved Uncle Arthur. I feel like before this goes any further and gets even uglier, we owe it to Arthur to handle this ourselves. We should sit down, just family, without the lawyers, and really talk. I told him I would think about it. I called Thorne. His advice was cautious but clear. The choice to meet with them was entirely up to me. But I was absolutely not allowed to discuss the details of the case, accept any paperwork, or say anything that could be interpreted as reaching an agreement or making a concession. If I chose to see them, he suggested having Helen there as a witness. I called Helen, and she immediately cleared her Saturday schedule. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Valerie was meticulously dressed in a soft, muted knit sweater with absolutely no expensive jewelry, her visual shorthand for humility. Mitchell wore a button-down shirt with no tie, the classic look of a man trying to appear open and transparent. I led them into the living room. Helen was already sitting in the armchair by the window. I introduced her simply as my friend, Helen, and watched Mitchell's eyes scan her before quickly looking away. He hadn't anticipated a witness. That tiny miscalculation told me they were planning this visit based on the old version of me, the one who no longer existed. We've been doing a lot of thinking lately, Mitchell began, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, a perfectly rehearsed posture of sincere remorse. Valerie and I understand that in trying to help you, some of the financial decisions we made, looking back, they might not look right. That's on us. We should have been more transparent. Siphoning my equity over 6 years into a shell company to cover the bad debts of his failing tech startup, and the word he chose to use was transparent. We aren't here to argue about the numbers, Valerie quickly added, a rehearsed tremor entering her voice. We came here because we are family, because Arthur was Mitchell's uncle and he loved him. And we love you, Evelyn. This whole legal process is going to hurt everyone. It's going to ruin Arthur's reputation. Is that really what he would have wanted? There it was. I had been waiting for them to play that card. Is that what he would have wanted? As far as psychological manipulation goes, it was a beautifully insidious question, because it is entirely unanswerable and aims straight for your grief. Bringing grief into a living room is a surefire way to make the boundaries of reality blur. But I thought of Arthur. I thought of his precise structural blueprints, and his quiet, unshakable belief that as long as the foundation is poured correctly, everything else will hold. What would he have wanted? He would have wanted his wife to be absolutely protected. He had built a multi-million-dollar hidden fortress to ensure exactly that. I think Arthur wanted me to be properly taken care of, I said, my voice perfectly level. That is exactly why he left everything to me. The muscle in Mitchell's jaw twitched. Evelyn! His tone shifted just enough to alter the entire atmosphere in the room. The warmth was still there on the surface, but underneath it lay something else, a distinct undercurrent of pressure. You need to think very carefully about what taking this all the way means for everyone. The counterclaim we filed. Crowley says there is a solid legal basis proving the 2018 agreement is completely valid. If the judge agrees, you won't just lose the case. You will lose the legal standing to even dispute those management fees. You could end up with absolutely nothing, having wasted your savings on Thorne's exorbitant legal fees. That is your attorney's opinion, I replied. My attorney sees things differently. There are also things that could come to light during the discovery phase, he continued, dropping his voice lower. You might not want the public knowing the details regarding Arthur's mental instability near the end, or the exact structure of that holding company, and why he chose not to include it in standard tax filings during his lifetime. If I prove he was already showing early signs of Alzheimer's when he established that trust, a judge and a jury might not look kindly on. Mitchell, I said, stop. He stopped. If you actually had a card in your hand that could destroy my case, your lawyer would have slammed it down on the table weeks ago. The only reason you are telling me this in my living room, without Crowley present, is because it doesn't exist. It's just a bluff. You've always been very good at bluffing. The room went dead silent. Helen sat perfectly still in her chair, not making a sound. Valerie chose that exact moment to lean forward, reaching across the coffee table to place her hand over mine. The gesture was incredibly gentle and completely practiced. "We just don't want you to go through all of this, Evelyn. The stress, the fighting. You deserve peace. We can settle all of this quietly between us, no courts, no putting everything out in the open. Isn't that worth something to you?" Her eyes actually welled with tears. I looked at her and thought, she has definitely used this before. The precise body language, the perfect facial expression. It was entirely too seamless to be real. I didn't dramatically pull my hand away. I just slowly, deliberately withdrew it. "I know you don't want to go to court," I said, standing up to signal that the meeting was over. "Thorne's office will be in touch regarding the upcoming deposition schedule." They left. I stood by the front window and watched the Tesla drive away. My hands were shaking slightly, but it wasn't from fear, or at least not entirely. It was the adrenaline, the sheer physical toll of holding an absolute, unwavering line, while Mitchell tried to dismantle my resolve. He was good at it. He had spent a lifetime honing those high-pressure tactics in the business world. But the shaking actually helped me. It reminded me that I wasn't a stone. This fight was costing me something, but the fact that I was choosing to pay the price and face them anyway meant everything. The fear didn't weaken my resolve. It confirmed it. I was right to fight. You don't shake like that over something that doesn't matter. Helen stayed for dinner. She made pasta, mostly because she had completely figured out where I kept everything in the kitchen by now. We didn't do a detailed breakdown of what had just happened. She just cooked, I set the table, and we ate together. Halfway through the meal, she looked up and said, "You were absolutely perfect out there." "I was scared to death," I told her. "The two things aren't mutually exclusive," she replied, and we left it at that. The deposition was set for a Tuesday in October, in a fourth-floor conference room of a downtown office building. Gray industrial carpet, a long table, and a court reporter with a stenotype machine. Thorne sat on one side with Richard Crowley and Mitchell on the other. I was seated at the head of the table because it was my case, a seating arrangement Thorne had quietly suggested beforehand. Valerie wasn't there. Her deposition was scheduled separately for Thursday. I had prepared for this moment the same way I used to prepare for difficult families at the hospital, thoroughly, specifically, and with the deep understanding that the person across from me was going to lose their emotional footing, which meant I had to be the anchor. I had reviewed every single document with Thorne twice. I knew the registration date of that shell company, the date of the first transfer, the totals, the patterns. I knew them the way I used to know antibiotic dosages. It wasn't because I had crammed for the deposition, but because I had lived inside those numbers for months, turning them over until they became part of the absolute truth I stood on. Mitchell looked older than he had in September. The past few weeks had stripped something away from him, not physically, but a certain quality, that effortless sense of authority he always carried around. Crowley remained slick and cautious, a seasoned pro at white-collar defense who, under any other circumstances, would have been a terrifying adversary. But as it turned out, they had a massive problem. That problem was Apex Tech Solutions, LLC. Thorne had dug into it thoroughly. The shell company was registered in 2017, the year before Arthur died. In the 8 months between Arthur's death and the first management fee deducted from my account, that company had not generated a single penny of revenue from any other client. Its sole source of income for its entire existence was the equity loans taken against the properties tied to my name and social security number. It looked absolutely nothing like a legitimate consulting firm. The second problem was the structuring. The forensic accountant Thorne hired was a compact, no-nonsense woman named Elaine Parker. I had met with her twice and trusted her implicitly. She had prepared a chart showing every single wire transfer from my commercial real estate accounts to Apex Tech Solutions. 41 transfers over 6 years. Every single one of them was between $9,000 and $9,900. Federal law mandates reporting for cash transactions and suspicious wire transfers at $10,000. This pattern of keeping transactions just under the limit, as Dr. Parker wrote in her report, was entirely consistent with structured money laundering designed to deliberately evade Bank Secrecy Act reporting requirements. Even more devastating, Thorne had pulled the original notarized documents for those equity loans, the ones supposedly taken out to fund property repairs. I had been bedridden at home recovering from cataract surgery at the time. Yet the authorization forms bore my signature and a notary stamp certifying that I had personally executed them in his presence. Thorne discovered that the notary was a junior employee working under Mitchell, and his notary license had been expired for 6 months when the stamp was applied. When Crowley laid out his client's position, arguing that the 2018 agreement was a fully disclosed and valid contract, Thorne produced the original document and began going through it line by line. Section 4.2, buried in paragraph 9 on page 8, Thorne read, then looked up. All consulting and restructuring fees will be assessed at the sole discretion of the trustee and may be modified without prior written notice. Mr. Hayes, can you tell me exactly when you modified the fee structure? It was an ongoing evaluation process, Mitchell said. And when exactly did you provide notice to Mrs. Hayes regarding the nature of these fees, as envisioned by Section 4.2? It was an implicit understanding. It was a flexible arrangement. I'd like to note for the record, Thorne said to the reporter, pushing a document across the table, that in all correspondence obtained through discovery between my client and Mr. Hayes from 2018 to 2024, including emails, text messages, and letters, there is not a single written notice from Mr. Hayes regarding any fees, not once in 6 years. Mitchell looked over at Crowley. Crowley's expression didn't change at all, which was an answer in itself. Mr. Hayes, did you disclose the existence of Apex Tech Solutions LLC to my client prior to or during the signing of the 2018 agreement, and clarify that the funds would be funneled into your private startup? A long pause followed. We discussed my background in tech ventures, Mitchell said. Aunt Evelyn wasn't well at the time, and we didn't dwell on the specifics. Did you explicitly mention the name of this entity? Another pause, even longer this time. Mitchell shifted in his chair. It was a tiny, involuntary movement, the kind a person makes when the seat beneath them suddenly becomes incredibly uncomfortable. I watched him and thought, this is what a lie looks like when it can no longer sustain its own weight. I don't recall if I mentioned the name, Mitchell said. I sat at the head of the table and didn't say a word. I had been told not to speak unless I was directly spoken to, and I have always been very good at following instructions that serve me. What I was watching was a man realizing, in real time, that the story he had been telling himself for years, that everything was technically legal, that it was backed by paperwork, that he wasn't really hiding anything, was completely falling apart under a targeted cross-examination. Mitchell's entire defense was built on the assumption that I was still that confused, half-blind woman sitting at the dining room table. He hadn't factored in 6 years of interest. He hadn't factored in a forensic accountant's charts. He hadn't factored in 41 separate wire transfers designed to evade detection, and he certainly hadn't factored in an expired notary stamp. Crowley requested a 15-minute recess. During the break, I walked out into the hallway to get a drink of water. Through the gap in the glass door of the conference room, I could see Mitchell and Crowley in an intense conversation. Mitchell's head was down, and Crowley was speaking in a hushed, intense voice, making a sharp cutting motion with his hand, the universal gesture for cutting your losses. Mitchell rubbed his face hard with both hands, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. It was the expression of a man doing math that was never, ever going to add up in his favor. I had seen that exact look before in the hospital, on the faces of arrogant family members trying to find loopholes in a terminal diagnosis. It meant that the escape route they had been counting on was officially gone. When we reconvened, Crowley requested a follow-up meeting and brought up the possibility of reopening settlement discussions. Thorne simply stated that he would consult with his client. When it was over, we walked out onto the downtown street. The October air was bright, crisp, and cleared the mind. Thorne allowed himself a very controlled, satisfied expression. He told me they would be coming back with a new number. I asked him what we should do. We let them make an offer, Thorne said, and then we decide whether there is more value in settling or taking this straight to trial. I looked down the street. Coffee shops, bookstores, ordinary Tuesday life moving in both directions. What happens if we go to trial? I asked. Everything we showed them today, Thorne said, pausing for a beat, plus the evidence regarding the structured wire transfers and the suspected use of fraudulent collateral to secure a federal pandemic loan from the Small Business Administration. I forwarded all of those materials to the U.S. Attorney's Office this morning. I looked at him, a criminal referral. It was my professional obligation, he said quietly. They came back with a new offer, $480,000. Thorne brought the paperwork to me on a Thursday afternoon, placing it on his desk without saying a word, waiting for me to finish reading it. I slid it back across the desk and told him no. He nodded. I figured you'd say that. Our position is incredibly strong. A civil trial will almost certainly recover the $650,000 in siphoned equity, plus interest, which brings us to about $780,000. Given the evidence of structuring and notary fraud, there is a very high probability the court will award punitive damages, which could easily double that amount. If the court finds the fraud was willful, they will likely be ordered to cover your attorney fees as well. He paused before adding, "Furthermore, the U.S. Attorney's Office contacted me this morning. They are opening a preliminary criminal investigation into structured money laundering and SBA loan fraud." I asked him what that meant for them. Structuring transactions to avoid federal reporting and forging notarized collateral to obtain federal loans carry severe federal penalties if indicted and convicted. We are talking heavy fines and up to 5 years in prison per count. With 41 transfers and 2 federal loans, their exposure is devastating. Whether the federal prosecutors choose to indict depends on factors beyond my control, but the referral has been made, and the pattern of criminal conduct is thoroughly documented. I thought about it for a moment. If we settle now, does the criminal investigation stop? A civil settlement has absolutely no bearing on federal criminal proceedings, Thorne said. Once a referral is made, the case belongs to the government. I understood. The choice before me was incredibly narrow. I could accept a discounted payout from Mitchell, or I could take the full measure of justice the court was about to hand me. But either way, the gears of criminal accountability had already been set in motion, and they were irreversible. Mitchell and Valerie were going to face the federal government, whether I cashed their check or not. Realizing that completely set me free. Compromise didn't make sense anymore. "Let's take it to court," I said. The civil trial lasted 3 days in early February. Dr. Elaine Parker testified for 90 minutes. She walked the court through all 41 transfers, the registration date of the shell company, its absurd history of zero legitimate revenue, the pattern of structuring to evade detection, and the falsified notary stamp. She was precise, detached, and answered Crowley's cross-examination with the calm of someone who had seen it all and could not be rattled by any attempt to confuse her. She managed to combine complex charts and plain English in the very same sentence. I watched the judge follow her every word. The facts, unadorned and laid out in order. That is really all justice needs. I testified for 45 minutes. I described signing those documents at my dining table right after Arthur's funeral, with gauze still over my eyes. I explained that I had no idea my properties were being used as collateral to fund a tech startup. I described the phone call from Mitchell, where he suggested coming over to handle routine maintenance paperwork. I spoke clearly. I didn't add any emotional commentary. I answered the questions exactly as they were asked, and I paused before every response, not out of hesitation, but out of the careful habit I had formed over a lifetime as a pediatric nurse. State the facts, say it once, say it clearly. Crowley put Mitchell on the stand, and from a purely human perspective, it was a painful thing to watch. Not because I felt sorry for him, but because I was watching a man try to maintain a lie that had completely lost its structural integrity. He stumbled over dates. He couldn't explain why he had set up the shell company a year before Arthur died without implying premeditation. At one point, he argued that the transfers were standard industry consulting fees, and Thorne asked him during cross-examination to name a single other client Apex Tech Solutions had besides me. Mitchell couldn't name one. A silence fell over the courtroom that lasted maybe 4 seconds. When everyone in a room understands exactly what 4 seconds of silence means, it feels incredibly long. The judge was a remarkably sharp woman in her 60s named Patricia Walsh. She spent 2 days deliberating, and her ruling came down on a Thursday morning. Thorne and I sat in his office to listen to the results. The judgment was a total victory for the plaintiff. Recovery of the $650,000 in fraudulently transferred equity. Prejudgment interest of $142,000. Based on the fact that the fraud was willful and took advantage of a victim's documented physical and emotional vulnerability, she awarded $500,000 in punitive damages. Attorney fees were covered at $95,000. The total judgment came out to $1,387,000. I read the number 3 times. Thorne remarked that Judge Walsh was not a merciful woman. The federal investigation moved much slower, the way federal agencies always do. But by April, Mitchell and Valerie were officially indicted by a federal grand jury, each facing 3 counts: wire fraud, SBA loan fraud, and structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements. Richard Crowley stepped down as their attorney. The case was well outside his scope of civil disputes, and the couple hired an expensive criminal defense lawyer based out of Washington, D.C. I received a call from a victim advocate at the U.S. Attorney's Office. They were incredibly professional and thoughtful, asking if I wanted to submit a victim impact statement for the sentencing hearing. I told them I would. I sat at my oak dining table to write it, in the exact same kitchen and the exact same chair where Valerie had once set down her macarons and offered to help me. It took me 2 nights and 3 drafts. It wasn't filled with anger. It was just a plain, precise description of what they had done and what it had cost. Not just the money, but the mental toll of 6 years of gentle manipulation, the quiet erosion of a person's confidence in their own judgment. I wrote that my husband had left behind a hidden trust because he knew exactly how vulnerable I would be after he was gone. He had built something I didn't even know about to protect me, and the defendants chose to use that exact vulnerability as a tool for theft. I stated that I was standing there to ensure the court record accurately reflected just how malicious their choices truly were. They reached a plea agreement in September to reduce their prison time. Mitchell was sentenced to 36 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and was ordered to pay full restitution to me, the Small Business Administration, and the IRS. Valerie received 24 months of probation, a heavy fine of $150,000, and community service due to her substantial cooperation with federal investigators. The gavel fell on a Tuesday. I wasn't in the courtroom. I stayed in my greenhouse looking over the last of the autumn basil. When Thorne called to give me the news, I simply thanked him. After hanging up, I stood in the greenhouse for a long time, looking at the glass shelves Arthur had helped me build all those years ago. The flower beds I tended alone, the herbs that would sprout again the next year no matter what happened. I realized that it was finally over. That summer, after the legal proceedings had completely settled, I went in for my final cataract checkup. My vision had recovered perfectly. After nearly 2 years under the crushing weight of a lawsuit, I finally understood that what I wanted most was time. Not luxury, not dramatic highs and lows, just time, peace, and the right to choose how to spend each day. The first thing I did after using the court settlement to pay off Thorne's legal fees was hire a contractor to completely renovate the greenhouse, taking care of all the boundary permits myself. That was the reason I had gone to the county tax office in the first place. An $8,000 permit that uncovered a fortress I never knew I had. Using a small portion of the massive fortune Arthur left behind, I established a foundation at the Richmond Community Hospital's pediatric ward, the Arthur and Evelyn Hayes Children's Recovery Wing. It isn't huge, it's just the right size. Arthur never would have wanted anything too flashy. I kept the brick townhouse in the Fan District. I just couldn't bring myself to leave the interior courtyard, the greenhouse, and that specific afternoon light in the kitchen. This house isn't haunted by grief. It was just lived in by grief. And those are 2 completely different things. Grief can be a companion rather than a heavy burden. I hired a landscaping company to expand the courtyard, and now it is a true botanical sanctuary, complete with gravel paths, a wooden bench, and a Japanese red maple that Eleanor picked out when she came to visit me in the spring. We planted it together on a Saturday morning, kneeling in the dirt without saying anything profound. It was just perfect. I started taking slow, deliberate trips. In October, I spent 2 weeks on the Oregon coast in the Pacific Northwest. Those rugged cliffs, the cold water crashing against the shore, and the towering redwoods were breathtaking. I went by myself and discovered that I actually preferred it that way. I would have late dinners at restaurants right on the water, drinking excellent Pinot Noir and reading on the patio, fully feeling the exact kind of happiness I had chosen to claim for myself. I made new friends too. Helen got me to join a book club, and I signed up for an advanced botanical watercolor class. That was where I met Margaret, a retired college professor with incredibly strong opinions on growing hydrangeas and a wonderful dry laugh. Helen and I still meet up for coffee and pasta, occasionally sitting out in my courtyard watching the nightfall. Mitchell reported to federal prison in January. I only know this because Thorne's office received a confirmation letter from the court regarding the mandatory restitution payment schedule. I didn't dig for any more information. Their mansion in Alexandria was auctioned off by the court to cover the fines and restitution, and Valerie moved into a modest suburban rental that she wouldn't have looked twice at in her past life. All those photos of Tuscany, Aspen, and St. Bart's on her social media were quietly and completely deleted during the criminal proceedings. Mitchell's company went through bankruptcy liquidation, and Apex Tech Solutions was legally dissolved by court order. I have no idea if they even talk to each other anymore. The shape of their lives now is simply the shape of the choices they made. In the months since everything settled down, I discovered something I didn't expect: a sense of lightness. It wasn't just simple happiness. I am still a widow, and I still live within the ordinary textures of loss and time. But that deep doubt in my own judgment, the one that had nested inside me for years, was finally completely gone. After Arthur died, I doubted myself so thoroughly that I handed over my judgment, my finances, and my certainty to someone else. And then, through nearly 2 years of incredibly difficult, highly focused attention, I took them all back with my own 2 hands. On a July afternoon, I sat on the bench under the Japanese red maple. I thought to myself, Arthur knew exactly who you were. He built that heavy fortress and left it to you because he believed that one day, when the fog finally cleared, you would know exactly what to do. He was right. I am 64 years old now. I take care of my greenhouse. I think about Arthur every single day, and I absolutely never sign anything, ever, without reading every single word first. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? If this story resonated with you, please share it, leave a comment, and let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much for listening. It truly means the world to me.